topic of this week was, again, accommodating resistance. And accommodating resistance is predicated on the strength curve itself. So the strength curve, in essence, basically is it's harder to lift on certain portions of the lift, and it is easier to lift on certain portions of the lift. So I want you guys to think for a second here about this, right? So let's say that you're doing a bench press. That's more like it. Let's say you're doing a bench press, okay? Is it harder here, or is it harder here, right? So again, like if I'm on the bottom of the lift or the top, what's more difficult? Well, the answer is clearly it's easier on the top of the lift than the bottom of the lift. If you're doing a squat, you ever see guys load up the bar with tons of weight and they're at the top of the lift, and or they load the bar with a ton of weight and they go down 1/4 and come back up? Why can they do that but could not go all the way down? Because of this strength curve. Typically, again, on a squat, on a bench press, you're weaker on the bottom, you're strongest near the top, okay? And that's the strength curve. So that's what this week's PhD Academy is all about. So now we go into essentially what accommodating resistance is. Accommodating resistance just does that. It accommodates the strength curve. So in the first lesson this week, we showed that, again, on a bench press, you're weaker on the bottom, you're stronger on the top. You add accommodating resistance, and why is that the case? First of all, because you have more of a mechanical advantage on the top than the bottom. So what happens is when you have the greatest mechanical advantage, the accommodating resistance will put the greatest force. When you have the lowest mechanical advantage, it'll put the least amount of force. So does that make sense, everyone? Okay, so let's talk about different types of accommodating resistance. This was our second lesson. We talked this week about 3 types of accommodating resistance. The first one we talked about was resistance bands, okay? So resistance bands themselves basically are just that. It's almost like a giant rubber band. And there's not really any weight on the band. I mean, very little weight. It's certainly not going to add any measurable resistance that you're going to see. You place the band around the bar, around a hook on the bottom, and what happens is when you lift on the bottom of the bar, the band's unloaded. But as you lift, what ends up happening is that the band gets stretched and stretched and stretched. You're not actually adding weight, you're adding elastic resistance. And so bands provide elastic resistance. When you talk, another form of accommodating resistance are chains. You guys ever see chains? So chains basically, again, are just that. They're chains, but if I'm lifting weight doing a bench press, when I go down, the chains get unloaded and rest on the ground. As I come up, the chains are coming off of the ground and into the air, and they're unloading off the ground and adding resistance to the bar. The chain is obviously off the ground to the greatest extent when I've reached near full lockout. It's lowest when I'm on the bottom. But I'm weaker on the bottom, I'm stronger on the top. Does that make sense? So basically what I'm saying is that, that's important. Now, the third type of accommodating resistance would be machine accommodating resistance. And the only one I know is Prime fitness equipment. So we have Prime fitness equipment in our lab. Ben Pekulski has Prime fitness equipment at MI40. I know like Daniel and Bailey has Prime fitness in their gym. The reason why is because you can essentially alter the strength curve on the machine, and that leads to a host of things. Obviously, our focus this week on Muscle PhD Academy was muscle, so we'll get right into that. So one of the things that we talked about was, can you gain more muscle when you're actually doing accommodating resistance? We did a study in our lab a few years ago. Actually, Jordan Joy was the main investigator when he was in our lab. And we did it on NCAA basketball players. And what we found is that when you added bands to the squat, when you add bands to the bench, that basketball players gained more lean mass than when you didn't add bands. Also very interesting is that the squat went up and the bench went up in strength when you did the bands on the squat and the bench, but we didn't put bands on the deadlift, and the deadlift didn't increase. So it suggests that the bands are going to help the lift that you work with, but overall they could increase lean mass. So that's, I think, pretty cool. So another thing that we talked about was a study, actually it's going to be tomorrow, and that is a study by Juha Holmi. So I talked about Juha. Juha's in Jyväskylä, Finland. He's a good friend of mine. He's kind of like the me of Finland. And he does a lot of cool strength training studies, he and his group. And what they ended up doing was they looked at accommodating resistance, and they did over a long, several-week study. One group just did accommodating resistance. One group did traditional resistance training. The first couple bouts, the accommodating resistance actually increased protein synthesis, which means that the stimulus for muscle growth was greater with the accommodating resistance. However, when you actually, if you kept doing accommodating resistance every day, near the end of the study, it wasn't any better than normal resistance training. So what does that tell you? It tells you that you need to change things up. And that's the key, is accommodating resistance is a tool, but you've got to periodize it. You're not going to do it every single workout, right? So then you ask, like, well, how do I still work different ranges of motion? One way is accommodating resistance. Another way that Ben Pekulski likes is selecting exercises that will actually stress certain areas of the muscle more, right? So I think that's going to be key, that you really understand that as well. So again, let me sum this up. The strength curve is basically means that the mechanical advantage along the lift changes along the lift. So if I'm on the bottom of a bench press, I'm weaker. From the top of a bench press, I'm stronger. That's number one. Two, accommodating resistance accommodates that, meaning it's an external resistance that increases as your mechanical advantage increases. We talked about 3 types. Bands is number one. So bands basically you put on the lift, and as you lift, it basically causes a external resistance that's caused by elasticity, the elastic energy, you know? Then if you're talking about chains on the other hand had actual weight resistance by virtue of the mass of the chains. The weight is unloaded on the bottom of the lift, and as you come up, it is it's coming off the ground, and that actually itself will provide resistance to the weight when you're lifting. Finally, we talked about Prime Fitness equipment, which is a machine which essentially accommodates resistance along the curve. We know that's super beneficial as well. All 3 of those have resulted in increases in muscle mass, strength, power, but the key is you've got to periodize. So if you just use accommodating resistance every day, even though it seems superior, you're not going to just keep getting gains from it. So with that said, guys, I'm going to go ahead and answer your questions. Leslie Bacon says, would you consider accommodating resistance good for beginners, or wait until we are more experienced? Great question, Leslie. I would first get the movement pattern down, and then I would move to more advanced techniques like bands. Paolita says, so bands and chains could increase the time under tension? Yes, they could increase the time under tension relative to the strength curve. I think that's the real point, absolutely. Because what's going on, studies show, like electromyography, as you come up, the muscle activation and force are less on the way up. But if you apply accommodating resistance, you are extending that window of tension. So absolutely. What bands would you recommend? You know, there's a variety of bands out there. I think Elite FTS has some good bands. So that would be good. Okay. What are the benefits of reverse bands? That's a really good question. So it's actually a very similar concept in a sense. If say I'm doing military press, okay? So first off, what are normal bands? As I'm coming up, the band resistance is coming up, okay? The opposite is true with reverse bands. You put the bands up on top of the ceiling. When I come down, basically, the bands are being pulled from the top of the rack, and that's actually applying a resistance that's helping unload the bar. So when I'm weakest, the bands are helping me on the way down. Then as I come up and I'm stronger, that band tension's released, and I'm having to actually lift the whole weight itself. So say normally you can hit 165 on military press with a normal bar, okay? But technically at the top portion, you probably could lift 185 for 10. She put 185 on there, put bands on. On the bottom, they're helping you, so you're 165, but at the top, they're unloaded, and you're able to lift 165. The advantage of that compared to normal bands is that the weight is real weight on the top, as opposed to elastic resistance. So I think as you're coming closer to more like a powerlifting competition, you're working on your lockout, I think that reverse bands could be very beneficial, and definitely I think beneficial for hypertrophy. Does accommodating resistance increase irisin levels? That's an interesting question. I would say yes, even though no one's looked at it. I would say yes because muscle damage. So irisin is a hormone that gets released from your muscle that seems to burn fat. When you cause muscle damage, irisin seems to leak out into the muscle. So I would think something that is adding resistance like that or increasing velocity would increase irisin. I wouldn't think of that as the primary way to use it, but I think that's not a bad idea. Can you use band resistance on any muscle group, or are there any groups where there is less benefit? You can use accommodating resistance on any muscle group. I mean, to be quite honest, you know, if Andy and I are lifting weights together right here, or Paul and I are lifting weights, I could use accommodating resistance without even bands. I could do arm curls, and you know, you could do partner assisted. So basically, as I near the top, he's making it harder for me. I mean, I think anything would work with accommodating resistance. Let's see. Giorgio Bazzoni asked, "Hey Doc, if I can train only 2 times per week, do you think it is better to eat almost only fat and proteins and vegetables during the rest days and carbs only at 2 days to train?" Yeah, I do. Lucas says, haha, yeah, Andy. What's up, Lucas? You want to say hi? Say what's up.
What's up, Luke? What's up, David? I saw you join too.
So those guys from Colorado?
Yes.
Cool. Andrea Grandone says, what's the ratio of weight to band resistance distribution? That's a tough question. Good question, Andre. So the answer is that you need to get at least 30% band tension to get a benefit from it. Studies that have done less than 30% don't get that benefit. So I say 30 to 50% of your weight, and periodize it just like you periodize your training. So don't just stick with the same accommodating resistance.
That hair dough.
Yeah, right? Thanks, man. I appreciate that. So, oh, you're here. Okay, cool. David Reimer says, what's up? What's up, man? Okay.
For some other questions?
Yeah, go shoot.
Sure. When programming accommodating resistance, what is the optimal rep range to work in?
When programming accommodating resistance, what's the optimal rep range to work in? If your goal is hypertrophy, 8 to 15 reps probably, 8 to 12 reps. And that's a generality. If your goal is strength, 1 to 5 reps. If your goal is power, 1 to 5 reps. If your goal is to make continual gains, periodize between those reps games.
How do you select overall band tension?
So basically, as far as selecting overall band tension, there's 2 ways you can do it. One, you can unload the bar and replace that load with band tension. That's the traditional way that guys like Matt Ray have done. In our study that we saw lean mass gains, Jordan Joy actually just literally added the band tension to the resistance itself. Because on the bottom, you're going to be pretty much the same because it's going to be unloaded. And on the top, you're going to add resistance. So in that case, you just literally I'd start with 30% band tension. The following week, go 40. The following week, go 50. And then possibly up the load on the normal bar and go back to 30 and repeat. And also periodize between bands and chains so you don't accommodate to one or the other.
So it's a learning process also.
It's a learning process for sure. Yeah, if you've never done bands before, every time I see someone didn't know bands and they put it on, that's why the person said about experience. People are going to go like all over the place. So you got to start with a lighter weight. You need to learn how to use bands before you jump all into that.
Would you use bands on strength work if you didn't have chains?
Okay. I prefer chains on strength work. If I don't have chains, I do reverse bands on strength work because I think it gives you more of a feel for like the actual load of when you're lifting heavy. But again, I mean, we've seen bands increase with strength, so I don't think that's a problem.
Would you recommend using bands consistently every workout, or would you switch it up? We actually talk about that tomorrow.
Yeah, we talk about it tomorrow for sure. So I'll tell you about 3 more questions here. But if so, basically the answer to your question is you need to periodize bands. So you can't use the same accommodating resistance every single workout, and I think that's key. So there's 2 ways you can switch that up. 1, you can use it like once a week. 2, after a few weeks, you can switch from bands to chains. Or you could switch to a partner-assisted resistance. Or you could use prime equipment. Reverse band works similar in nature to negative reps with traditional bar. I would say no, because negative reps, you're basically having someone negative reps, you're basically have someone you're helping them on the way up, and certainly you're helping on the bottom portion of it. So, well, I guess in a way, yeah, I guess it's a good point. In a way, yeah, for the first half of the lift, I think from this point to this point, yes. On the second half, no. Whereas on normal negative reps, you're helping all the way up, and then you're going on the way down. So, have you measured triceps EMG with bands as well during the bench press? Is it higher also? Yes. Your muscle activation in triceps is higher on bench press. And then the second part of your question, does the ratio of pec to tris EMG change with versus without bands? I think it stays relatively constant, but at the top you may have a little bit more tricep work. If nutritional ketosis is minimum 0.5 blood ketones, then what does it mean when one ranges 0.1 to 0.4 blood ketones? Miguel, it's all relative to you, to be quite honest. So if you have someone who doesn't use ketones very well, they might have 5 millimolars. Doesn't necessarily mean anything. So I think in the general rules, you want to likely get above 0.4. But if you're super lean and you use ketones really well, your blood levels might not be as high. You need to go off how you feel. So if you're 0.1 to 0.4 and you feel horrible, well, you're not producing ketones and you're not using them. If you're 0.4 and you feel like $1,000,000, you might be producing a lot of ketones, but just using them. Okay. Are different muscle fibers recruited using bands? Yeah, you are going to recruit more fast twitch muscle fibers. And that's Daphne. Yeah, Daphne. So you're going to use a lot more fast twitch fibers.
On that note, are you going to activate those fast twitch fibers more quickly using banded resistance?
Good question. So there's 2 ways you're going to activate, going to Daphne's question, there's 2 ways that you're going to activate the fast twitch fibers, okay? This is actually kind of cool. I'm glad you brought this up. So 1, there's this principle called the size principle. It's also called Henneman's principle. And what it basically means is that, like, as a load increases, I recruit more fast twitch fibers. So just by nature, as I'm having to recruit more muscle fibers because there's heavier load, I'll tap into the fast twitch fibers more. Secondly, however, your body compensates. On the bottom of a lift, Daphne, when you're here, because the weight's lighter, your body knows that it's going to be harder on the top, and it accommodates, basically, it's called compensatory acceleration. And what that means is that I'm going to accelerate more in the bottom to make up for the fact there's more resistance on the top. So like my rate of force development, which I'm sure Will's thinking right now in the other room, is going to increase. So what that means, in order to increase my rate of force development, on the bottom I'll have to recruit more fast twitch fibers by virtue of velocity, by speed, and at the top I'll have to recruit them by virtue of having a greater load. Jason Dames asks, what are your thoughts on ketonics test, or is it accurate? Probably more accurate than urine, less accurate than blood. Okay, 2 more questions. Christian asks, Any info regarding baking soda as a use to combat lactic acid building in the muscle. It's one of the most powerful things you possibly use as an ergogenic aid. Christian, studies show far greater improvements in performance with things like bicarbonate or other buffers like that than beta-alanine, like far. What's the problem? It messes your stomach up. So you're going to need to practice with that and take very little, but it is an extremely powerful tool that you might want to use. The problem with using a buffer is I'm not certain if buffering metabolites is ideal for hypertrophy. That's another topic. Would holding an isometric contraction, is the last question I'll take. This is from Lucas Snyder. Would holding an isometric contraction near the lockout of a lift using bands, do you think that would help increase strength pertaining to that lift? Lucas, you increase strength relative to the range of motion that you train. So studies basically show if I'm pressing here and holding here, that means I'm going to get stronger in this position. It won't necessarily translate to the full lift itself. And that's very consistent in motor learning literature, and it's consistent in resistance training literature. It may cause some hypertrophy, which could help with the lift. So what is the impact of BCAAs on ketosis? Initially, what ends up happening is that it'll knock down fatty acids, so it might not initially be good for ketosis, but later you actually rebound and will metabolize more fat. So I actually think BCAAs strategically can be good for ketogenic dieting. It's really good.